Thank you guys very much for joining us. My name's Adam Hill. I'm the Vice President of Operations here at Scarborough. And we have with us today Eric Kulish from American Shipper. Eric's been writing for American Shipper for a little more than a decade now. And so hopefully we're going to get some good insight into some of the things that are kind of coming out of the current administration. But before we do that, just real quick, Scarborough International brings you these webinars through what we call Scarborough University. It is our own internal and external training house, and we are doing these now twice a month. So please make sure you check your calendars. And for the next upcoming webinar, we also have a seminar coming up in Kansas City here in a couple of weeks on doing business in Canada. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Eric and let him get started on his piece. And please make sure you send your questions in, and I will be moderating the discussion, kind of watching the questions come in. Once he kind of gives an overview, we will open it up, hopefully, and leave about half an hour or so, maybe a little bit more for just your questions that come in. So Eric, thank you very much for joining us. Please take it away.
Thanks a lot, Adam. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you to Scarborough International for having me on the program. It's definitely an opportune time to hold this webinar. There's so much going on that impacts the import-export industry right now, as you all know, and it's very difficult to stay on top of it, but more importantly, to understand it. So that's why at American Shipper magazine, we started this kind of sister website called the Adam Smith Project to kind of try and grapple with some of the trends that affect supply chains right now, especially with the backlash against globalization that we saw with the Brexit campaign in the United Kingdom, and then with the election of Donald Trump. And there's so many potential policy changes and political changes in Washington, more so than any administration in recent history, that it's one of those things we just try to focus on and give people some more insight into. So, we're less than 100 days, we're nearing the 100-day mark in the Trump administration, and I'd say there's as many questions now as there are, or probably more questions than answers, which is a little bit unusual for at this point in an administration. But I think that reflects the fact that we have a president who's still learning on the job, and an administration that's still filling in. So what I'd like to do is kind of give a quick overview of just some of the macro, high-level developments that are going on in Washington that are affecting or surrounding the administration. Then talk a little bit about some of the things on the Trump trade agenda. Talk about NAFTA, where things could be headed there. Talk a little bit about the border adjustment tax, and also the new nominee for Customs and Border Protection. As everybody knows, Trump came into office on a populist platform. His goals were to stop outsourcing, revitalize domestic manufacturing, and the defense industrial base, hike import tariffs, renegotiate NAFTA, and take a much tougher approach to enforcement, positions that would basically upend decades of trade policy if carried out. And soon upon taking office, President Trump withdrew the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement with 11 other Pacific Rim nations that would have opened up access to foreign markets for U.S. goods and had other benefits. But in recent weeks, we've seen several flip-flops or changes in position, at least from the president rhetorically, on some of those populist themes in the trade arena that have held through the campaign in the first few months. And I think there's a realization that maybe you can't get that many things done with such a radical or an extreme agenda that's trying to upend the apple cart all at once. So I think you'll still hear some of the populist rhetoric and speeches and so forth to satisfy the base and some of the voters, but seems to be a turning to more traditional positions in practice. But you never know. A week from now that could flip again the other way. And I think that's just one of the things we're dealing with right now that makes it so difficult. There's just so much inconsistency, and we can get into some of these later, some of the issues that are at the political level in Washington that are influencing that. But one thing I would mention is that there's really no process for coordinating policy as you might have with a better organization or institutions in a traditional administration. You have different messages coming from different officials that often conflict. The president will say something, the Secretary of Commerce will say something different on the same issue, the Secretary of State will say something more, slightly in a different manner. And so it's tough to triangulate, what's the actual official position when there's nothing concrete yet. So let's look at some of the things on the trade agenda. What are Trump's trade priorities? As everybody knows, he's talked about addressing what he believes are inequities in NAFTA, negotiating trade deals that are more fair to U.S. workers, protecting intellectual property rights, rolling back unfair Chinese trade practices, opening foreign markets, resetting trade relations with China, especially on things like steel, taking a tougher, using more remedies at the World Trade Organization against China and so forth. One thing that's instructive to know about their mindset in the Trump administration is they're very skeptical about multilateralism, multilateral trade deals. I think it emanates from this populist and nationalist mentality among some of his key advisors, and that Trump appears to hold. So, the thinking is multilateral deals. The U.S. is at the mercy of other partners, can't get the best terms, and has suffered as a result. So, as you see with NAFTA, but also with other trade agreements, they profess the desire to look at the existing free trade agreements and possibly tear them apart and then go back and do bilateral deals. So, NAFTA, or maybe the Central American Free Trade Agreement with, Colombia and some of the other countries in Chile. They might do one-on-one deals and, trying to improve the terms in their minds. Of course, that's a lot of work, and I don't know if that's practical and will come to fruition, but that's kind of what they're talking about. China trade relations. The president has been very tough on China for trade practices, unfair trade practices like dumping in the United States, but also currency manipulation, which in his mind has been a big problem. But most economists say China's done much better on or stopped manipulating its currency several years ago. You saw some softening of Trump's position against China after the Chinese premier visited his Mar-a-Lago estate for a summit last week. And now Trump is saying China is not a currency manipulator. And he said he could get some better trade terms for China. And the reason for that is because the United States wants China's help on dealing with North Korea and the nuclear weapons program there that's become a flashpoint in the world right now. So it's kind of interesting because some of the Trump administration officials and Trump himself has signaled, hey, we're not going to use geopolitical issues to undercut pursuit of unfair trade practices that disadvantage workers. If there's bad trade terms out there, we're going to go after them, and we're not going to worry about national security or other things that may compromise what position we take on trade. But as you see, the realities of the world kind of infringe on that, and it's not as easy to always follow through. There's also another change of heart is apparently on the Export-Import Bank, which maybe some of you or your clients use to help finance exports. Trump was criticized the Export-Import Bank during the campaign as an example of crony capitalism. You know, he wants to supposedly drain the swamp in Washington, and the Ex-Im Bank, you know, supposedly gives favors and loan guarantees to multinational corporations that don't really need them. But now Trump, in an interview with the Wall Street Journal, said that he thought the Export-Import Bank was actually helpful to small businesses. And he recently, last week, appointed 2 men to be on the board of directors. So that's important because the Ex-Im Bank has been operating with only 5 people, which is less than a quorum that's needed to vote on big applications for loan guarantees. So if they get confirmed by the Senate, that should loosen up the pipeline or the backlog of applications there. Another development is the nomination of Robert Lighthizer to be the U.S. Trade Representative. That is hung up right now. The confirmation is hung up in the Senate. He's a former U.S. Deputy U.S. Trade Representative from about 30 years ago. And then in the private sector, he worked as a trade attorney defending companies against filing a lot of claims against Chinese companies for dumping, especially in the steel industry and so forth. But he has a lot of support even from Democrats, but it's hung up right now because Democrats are using a provision in the trade law that says a U.S. trade representative cannot have ever represented a foreign government. He did a little bit of work for the Brazilian government, some in the 80s, and so he needs a waiver to get through that. And there's willingness to give him a waiver, but Democrats are leveraging that to get something else, some other legislation passed that they want from the Republicans. So we'll see how that plays out. Trump 3 weeks ago signed 2 executive orders related to trade. One of them deals with trade deficits. Trump and some of his advisors feel trade deficits are a benchmark or a measure of a problem in trade relations. So if we have a trade deficit overall or a trade deficit with a particular country, that's by definition, there must be a problem in trade and imbalance and needs to be corrected. So the Commerce Department and the USTR have 3 months to put together a report on what are the causes of those deficits. They're going to examine deficits on a country by country and product by product basis, and then they'll use the results supposedly to find ways to decrease trade deficits and increase exports. Now, many worry that whatever mechanisms we take to reduce those deficits could lead to retaliation from other countries, and consumers could pay more if there's tariffs or quotas or whatever. So we'll have to see how that goes. Most economists would say that it's misguided to look at trade deficits as a benchmark for setting trade policy because the deficit's more a function of savings rate in the country and the fact that we have to go outside the country to borrow money and to finance our imports. And usually, historically speaking, most deficits occur when the economy and the manufacturing sector are at their strongest, and vice versa. So there's really no correlation between deficits and manufacturing employment, living standards, and incomes. The second executive order dealt with anti-dumping and countervailing duty enforcement. It specifically calls for plans and strategies to combat the underpayment of anti-dumping and countervailing duties and the importation of inadmissible and counterfeit merchandise. So DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, is supposed to tighten up bonding requirements for certain importers and go after IPR violations. So they're working on a 90-day plan as well. I don't think there's really a whole lot new here because I think it's just a way to send a message, but U.S. Customs has just stepped up enforcement of anti-dumping and countervailing duty evasion in the past year or so, using new legislation from Congress that gave it more tools. Congress has made that a priority area, and so now there's a more formal process for CBP to investigate claims of evasion of duty orders and so forth. So really, the executive order doesn't change a whole lot. It's just kind of Trump putting a marker around that.
Well, and I think, especially when we talk about enforcement, we've even seen it over the past really year, is that customs in all areas, not just ADD, CVD, there's a lot of areas where they've kind of seemed to have made a shift at some point from a partner to more of an enforcement stance here over the last really 6 months. We've seen a big uptick in potential audit letters going out to larger importers and things like that. So I think with this administration, we're going to see a tighter stance on enforcement all the way around. And I think a lot of that stems from is that, prior to 9/11, U.S. Customs reported up through the Department of the Treasury, and their number one objective was to protect the revenue of the United States. And that's really what a lot of this is around. This kind of enforcement is around protecting that revenue. Now obviously they report it through Homeland Security, and their number one objective is to protect our borders. But I don't think that we should forget that, they are also protecting the revenue of the United States, and that's a big focus on what they do. And I have a feeling this administration is really going to push that forward.
I agree, and I think CBP would say that they're not going. Those audit letters and so forth they haven't really changed their stance or being that more over or that tougher. They're just, the audit letters are a way for them to kind of target who they go after, and it's kind of a way to, kind of target that enforcement. But I know a lot of people have been getting them, so it has changed things a little bit.
Right.